12 meters beneath the scorched remains of the old Reich Chancellery Garden, the air was heavy with the smell of damp concrete, diesel exhaust, and the faint, sweet rot of a dying city. It was April 1945. Above ground, Berlin was being pulverized by the concentrated weight of 2.5 million Soviet troops and 22,000 pieces of artillery. But inside the Führer bunker, time moved differently. In this subterranean labyrinth of narrow corridors and cramped rooms, reality was not something dictated by the maps or the reports from the front. It was something dictated by the will of one man. For years, Adolf Hitler had operated on the belief that his will alone could bend the arc of history. He had survived assassination attempts, outmaneuvered seasoned generals, and conquered a continent against all conventional logic. Even as the Anglo-American forces surged from the west and the Red Army swallowed the east, Hitler maintained a terrifying, manic optimism. He spoke of miracle weapons, of Alpine fortresses, and of a sudden collapse in the alliance between Washington and Moscow. To those around him, he seemed like a man possessed by a vision only he could see. But on April 22, 1945, that vision finally shattered. History records many turning points of World War II: Stalingrad, Al Alamein, D-Day. But this was the day the psychological fortress collapsed. This was the day the architect of the Second World War finally looked at the maps, looked at his generals, and admitted the words he had forbidden anyone in Germany to speak: "The war is lost." To understand the weight of that moment, one must understand the state of Berlin in late April. The city had been declared a fortress, but it was a fortress of ruins. The defense of the capital had been left to a ragtag assembly of the Hitler Youth, boys as young as 14, and the Volkssturm, elderly men armed with outdated rifles and a handful of Panzerfausts. The professional army, the Wehrmacht, had been hollowed out. The visions that existed on Hitler's maps were in reality little more than a few hundred exhausted men with no fuel and no ammunition. Hitler himself was a shadow of the man who had stood before cheering crowds at Nuremberg. His hair was gray, his posture was hunched, and his left hand shook uncontrollably from what many historians now believe was Parkinson's disease. He lived in a state of chemical-induced hyper-awareness, fueled by the daily injections administered by his personal physician, Theodor Morell. Despite his physical decay, his grip on the military command remained absolute. He was still moving phantom armies across the map, ordering counterattacks that were physically impossible to execute. The specific hope that Hitler clung to in late April was centered on an SS general named Felix Steiner. Steiner was a seasoned commander, and Hitler had ordered him to take every available man and launch a massive pincer movement to cut off the Soviet forces encircling Berlin. In Hitler's mind, the Steiner attack would be the turning point that would lead to a final, miraculous victory. At 3 p.m., the daily military situation conference began in Hitler's small briefing room. The room was crowded. Present were General Hans Krebs, the chief of the Army General Staff, General Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm Keitel, and several aides. The air was thick with tension. The Soviet ring around the city was tightening by the hour. The roar of the Stalin organs, the Soviet Katyusha rockets, could be heard even through the thick concrete walls of the bunker. Hitler opened the meeting by asking for a report on Steiner's progress. There was a long, agonizing silence. The generals looked at one another, none wanting to be the one to speak. Finally, General Krebs admitted the truth. The Steiner attack had never happened. Steiner had looked at the forces available to him, a few scattered battalions and some technical units, and realized that a counterattack would be suicide. He had simply refused to move. More than that, Steiner didn't even have the men Hitler thought he had. The army group was a fiction. For a few seconds, Hitler sat in total silence. It was a silence more terrifying than any of his previous outbursts. Then, the dam broke. What followed was a 3-hour tirade that those present would remember for the rest of their lives. Hitler arose from his chair, his face turning a deep, dark purple. He screamed that he had been betrayed. He lashed out at the SS, the organization he had once called his most loyal Praetorian Guard, for Steiner's disobedience. He attacked the army generals, calling them cowards, liars, and traitors. He claimed that his orders had been systematically sabotaged from the very beginning of the war. He screamed that the German people had failed him. He said they were not worthy of his greatness, that they were a weak nation that deserved to perish in the struggle against the superior strength of the East. This was the ultimate expression of social Darwinism. The ideology he had built his career on now turned against his own citizens. If Germany could not win, Germany did not deserve to exist. But then the screaming stopped. Hitler slumped back into his chair. His voice dropped to a hollow, lifeless whisper. He looked at Jodl and Keitel and said, "It is over. The war is lost." He told them they could leave. He told them they could go to the south, to the Alpine Redoubt, where some officials were trying to organize a final stand. But he announced that he would remain in Berlin. He would stay in the bunker, and when the end came, he would take his own life.
This was the moment the Third Reich truly died. The legal surrender would come weeks later, but the psychological surrender happened in that small, dimly lit room on April 22. For the first time, the man who had convinced the nation that he was a messiah of destiny admitted that he was merely a man who had failed. The atmosphere in the bunker changed instantly after the breakdown. The rigid discipline of the Nazi court began to dissolve. In the hallways, officers began to smoke, a practice Hitler had strictly forbidden. People started to drink openly. The court of the Führer became awake. Everyone knew that they were living in a tomb. Hitler's decision to stay in Berlin was a final act of theatricality. He wanted a Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods. He saw his death not as a tragedy, but as a dramatic conclusion to the epic he had written for himself. He spent the following days in a strange state of calm resignation. He dictated his final political testament, a document filled with the same hatreds and delusions that had fueled his rise to power. He blamed the Jews for the war. He blamed his generals for the defeat, and he called on the German people to continue the struggle even after his death. On April 29th, in the early morning hours, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief civil ceremony. The witnesses were Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. It was a macabre scene, a wedding in a bunker, while the Soviet troops were only blocks away. Shortly after the ceremony, Hitler received news that his Italian ally, Benito Mussolini, had been executed by partisans, and his body hung upside down in a square in Milan. This news likely reinforced Hitler's resolve to ensure that his own body would be destroyed beyond recognition. The final day came on April 30th. The Soviet troops were fighting for the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of German democracy, just half a mile from the bunker. Hitler ate a quiet lunch with his secretaries. He said his goodbyes to the staff, shaking hands with those who had served him in the final weeks. Then he and Eva Braun retired to his private study. A single gunshot rang out at approximately 3:30 p.m. When his aides entered the room, they found Hitler slumped on the sofa. He had shot himself in the temple. Eva Braun lay beside him. She had taken a cyanide capsule. Following Hitler's strict instructions, their bodies were carried up the stairs to the Chancellery Garden, placed in a shell crater, soaked in gasoline, and set ablaze. As the flames rose, the remaining bunker staff stood at the entrance and gave a final Nazi salute, while Soviet shells continued to rain down around them. The question of when Hitler knew he had lost is a subject of intense debate among historians. Some argue he knew as early as December 1941, when the German advance stalled outside Moscow and the United States entered the conflict. Others point to the summer of 1943, after the failure of the Battle of Kursk. But there is a difference between a strategic realization and a personal acceptance. Throughout the war, Hitler had been a master of compartmentalization. He could look at a map showing a total collapse and focus instead on a single technical detail of a new tank, convincing himself that this one machine would change everything. He used his charisma and his capacity for rage to suppress any doubt in himself or his subordinates. To admit defeat was to admit that his entire worldview, his belief in his own infallibility, was a lie. That is why April 22, 1945 stands out. It was the moment the compartmentalization failed. When the Steiner attack, the final pillar of his imaginary victory, crumbled into nothingness, there was nothing left to hide behind. The wall of delusion he had built around himself for 12 years finally came down. The tragedy of this delay is measured in millions of lives. In the months between the obvious military defeat of Germany in 1944 and the final realization in April 1945, more people died than in the previous years of the war combined. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were sacrificed in hopeless last stands. The concentration camps were accelerated to their horrific conclusion. Cities were turned to ash. All of this occurred because one man refused to accept the reality of his own failure. When we look back at the footage of Berlin in May 1945, the white flags hanging from ruined windows, the exhausted women clearing rubble by hand, and the endless lines of prisoners being marched to the east, we are looking at the aftermath of a catastrophe that could have been shortened. The day Hitler knew he lost was not just a personal moment of clarity for a dictator. It was the moment the engine of the most destructive regime in human history finally ran out of fuel. It was the moment the myth of the 1,000-year Reich was exposed for what it was, a nightmare that ended in a hole in the ground, surrounded by the ruins of a city that had once been told it would rule the world. History is often written in the grand movements of armies and the signing of treaties, but sometimes history is found in the silence of a briefing room, where a man who thought he was a god finally realized he was a ghost. On April 22, the maps were put away, the shouting died down, and the world began the long, painful process of waking up from the darkness. The bunker was eventually demolished by the Soviets, and today the site is an unremarkable parking lot in the center of a reunited Berlin. There is a small information board that marks the location, but there is no monument. The city has moved on, built over the site of its greatest shame. But the lesson of that day remains, that no amount of will, no amount of propaganda, and no amount of walls can indefinitely hold back the weight of truth. The war was lost long before Hitler admitted it, but the world could truly begin to heal until the man in the bunker finally stopped fighting the inevitable. As the sun set over the ruins of Berlin on that April evening, the sound of the guns didn't stop, and the dying didn't end immediately. But the spell was broken. The Nazi regime was no longer a terrifying force of nature. It was a corpse waiting to be buried. And in the dark corridors beneath the earth, the architect of the ruins sat alone, finally understanding that the future he had tried to forge had burned to nothing in the fires he himself had lit.